Hi, I'm Larry Karnas from the ESX Lab, and in this video I'm going to show you how to do an initial install of ESXi 8.0 onto a hosted virtual lab environment. The steps that I'm going to give you in this video are equally applicable to both ESXi being run in a lab environment on a virtual machine or installing ESXi on a physical machine. Where the steps do differ, I'll point that out to you. So what I'm going to do is reach out to my remote lab environment, and I do that through a web browser. I'm going to use Firefox. If you're using a physical machine, this step is completely unnecessary, but because my labs are hosted as virtual machines, I have to go into the infrastructure server. So I use self-signed digital certificates, so I get a warning. Because I know it's my own server, I don't mind. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to add a security exception. This just basically says that I should permanently trust the self-signed certificate that my ESXi host is using. So I will confirm it. And what I'll get is a login screen for my vSphere environment. So I'm going to install ESXi onto a virtual machine running on an ESXi host. It's called a nested hypervisor. It's a great way to build a lab environment. So I'm going to use the credentials provided. And we'll log in. Again, none of this is necessary if you're installing on a physical machine. We will get to the point shortly where we actually boot our ESXi host. And if you have a physical machine, you would just connect physical install media, either a CD/DVD image that you've downloaded from VMware or a partner, or a USB thumb drive where you've installed the ESXi install media image. And away we go. So in my case, I'm just going to go to the VMs and templates view. I'm going to pick the first ESXi host in my virtual lab environment. That's this one. And what I can see is that it's a powered off virtual machine. Now, because it's a virtual machine, one of the things I have to do is I have to be able to open a remote console on this virtual machine. And in my lab environment, the remote console that comes in my lab environment, to be honest, is a little out of date. So what I'm going to do is show you how to update the remote console application. So I'm going to start the File Explorer. And from here, I'm going to map a network drive. So I'm just going to go to this PC. I'm going to map a network drive because I have a file share for vSphere media that I've downloaded. And all I have to do is type in the UNC name, which is... So this is a share that's sitting on a server in my lab environment. I'm just going to say reconnect at sign-in time and finish. And here is my new vShare, and I called it V because it has vSphere media. And VMware VMRC is the VMware Remote Console. This is the application I need to upgrade. So I'm going to open it. I'm going to run it. Now it comes in as an MSI file, so it needs to be downloaded from the share. It needs to be unpacked, and then once it's unpacked locally, Windows will hand control to the installer. So this is going to take a few seconds. And we're ready to go when we actually get the installer application. So I'm just going to say next, accept the license, and I'm going to do a default install, so I don't need to change the location. I will check for product updates, but I'm not going to join the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program because this is a temporary lab environment. If it was something that I was going to run in production, I would definitely want to provide VMware with telemetry feedback because they use that telemetry information to see how their products are working in the field and make improvements. So we'll say next. We'll upgrade because the old version actually of the remote console that's actually installed by default in my lab environment doesn't work with ESXi 8.0. So we'll be done in a few seconds. And we're done. So now that we're done, I can put away the two File Explorer windows, and you'll notice there's an Open with VMRC. Now what I'd like to do before I do that is I'd like to zoom in a little bit. And what you'll see is my virtual ESXi host has 4 CPUs. It has 0 megahertz used because it's powered off. It has 20 gigs of RAM, 350 gigs of vDisk, and it has 4 network adapters. And it has other hardware components as well. Let's open the remote console. Now, again, it uses a self-signed digital certificate, so I'm going to trust it and connect anyway. What this is a window into my powered off virtual ESXi host, whose name, by the way, is ESXi80_ESXi1.ESXlab.com. Now you notice it's powered off. This would be no different than if you had a powered off physical machine. Now in a powered off physical machine, you would have to connect the install media by burning it to a CD-DVD and putting it in a connected CD-DVD reader, or by copying it to a USB key and arranging for your host to boot off the USB thumb drive. Because this is a virtual machine, I can just power it on. To make my lab environment a little easier for people to work with, what we've done is we've set up in our lab environment something called a Pixie boot server. So this Pixie boot server has been pre-configured with different ESXi install media images going all the way back to ESXi 5.5. And you'll notice I have an install media option for ESXi 6.0, 6.5, 6.7, 7.0, and 8.0. Now what this Pixie boot server will do is simply feed ESXi the same install packages that ESXi would get if you were installing off physical install media or a USB key. So I'm going to hit enter because I want to do ESXi 8.0. Now let me just recenter the console. And you'll notice all the packages are being pulled in. And what's happening is the Pixie boot server is delivering these packages from the Pixie boot server to the bootloader using TFTP. This is what my PXE or pre-boot execution environment boot server does. These are exactly the same packages that you would get off VMware install media. As a matter of fact, this media is the VMware supplied ESXi 8.0 general availability release. So this is 100% exactly the same as what VMware provided. I've made no alterations, no changes. So the experience you see here would be exactly the same as the experience that you would have if you installed ESXi yourself. Now it does take a little bit of time because there's about 600 megabytes of stuff to pull down from my Pixie boot server. It doesn't take too long. Once everything's been pulled down, what you'll see is the Pixie boot server will hand control over to the software that's been downloaded. And when it does that, that will launch the ESXi installer. And here's the installer booting up right now. What it's doing is it's uncompressing all of the packages that it pulled down into a RAM disk. This will take a few minutes. You can see the various components that are being unpacked and installed into that RAM disk. And what I'd like to point out as this is happening is just like Windows uses Windows to install Windows and Linux uses Linux to install Linux, ESXi uses ESXi to install ESXi. And so if you're preparing ESXi install media, it's important that you make sure your install media has drivers for all of your storage controllers, all of your physical SAN controllers, all of your network adapters, and all of the other components that either your server manufacturer bakes into their servers or add-on components that you've included with your server. If you don't have drivers for them, the ESXi installer can't recognize these devices and it can't use them during the install process. That's not always a big deal because you can install drivers after ESXi is up and running if you have high-end storage controllers or network controllers that are not needed to access the local install volume. The local install volume is usually a spinning disk device or an SSD device, hopefully in a mirror configuration so that the failure of one device doesn't bring down the entire ESXi install. It is very common for the installer to just sit and think for the last few seconds, waiting for the final packages to install, initialize, and get ready for the installer to move on. So we're back. The installer has launched, and it has brought up the main greeter screen for the ESXi installer. And so what we'll see is that it is installing ESXi 8.0.0. It mentions that ESXi installs on most systems. That's actually not entirely true. It installs on PC server class systems, and some people manage to make it work on desktops and notebooks, but VMware does not certify or support ESXi installed in desktops, notebooks, small form factor PCs like Intel Next Units of Computing or NUCs or things like that. It really does expect PC server hardware. You can get all of the compatibility information on what servers, what software, what hardware, what add-on cards and so on are supported by VMware from their hardware compatibility guide. So I'm going to click in the window and launch the installer. So I just hit enter. Now this installer is a character cell based installer, so there's no point in click functioning while this is going on. So you either accept the license agreement or you don't. If you don't accept, nothing happens. So I'm going to hit F11 to accept and move on. What the installer does now is it scans for supported storage controllers and storage devices behind those storage controllers. It doesn't show you the storage controllers, it just breaks them down into storage devices that are behind local controllers or storage devices that are behind SAN-based controllers. This would be fiber controllers, iSCSI controllers, fiber over Ethernet controllers, InfiniBand controllers, that sort of thing. So in our case, what we have is a single storage volume of 350 gigabytes. If I had multiple volumes, I could use the arrow keys to arrow up and down, pick the volume I want to install ESXi. But as we only have one, I will hit enter to accept it. Now, if I want to see some details, I can hit F1. And when I hit F1, what I get is slightly more details about the install volume. Here we go. So what do we have? I can see that the storage volume is a VMware virtual disk, which makes sense because my ESXi host is a virtual machine. I can see that it's behind this storage controller. VMHBA 0 is VMware Host Bus Adapter 0, Controller 0, Target 0, LUN 0. It thinks it's a parallel SCSI controller. You can see the LUN ID is 0, the target ID is 0. You can see the raw storage capacity of the volume. You can see the hardware path on ESXi. This is just where the volume is accessed through the file system. I can see that there are no ESXi partitions or file systems on it. It's not an SSD. There's no VMFS data stores on it. This is always a good thing to do. So I'm going to hit OK to dismiss this details pop-up. And I'm going to hit Enter, as it mentions right here, to accept. Now, we have to set the keyboard. ESXi cannot auto-detect different keyboards. It defaults to US 101, 104 style keyboards. If you lived in a different part of the world, you would just scroll up or down by hitting the up and down arrow keys to select the keyboard that you have physically connected to your PC server. Now I have to type in a root password. This is the local administrator account password. It has to be somewhere between 8 and 20 characters long. It has to have a mix of uppercase, lowercase, digits, and punctuation, brackets, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to type in a password. And it checks to make sure that my passwords match. So we'll accept that. And then what it does is it gives me a warning that the CPUs in my PC server that's running the virtual host are getting a little old. So it tells me that the CPUs in this host are not officially supported in ESXi 8.0, but it's perfectly good to use these CPUs in a lab environment. All this is VMware's way of saying we haven't rigorously tested these CPUs in a large-scale production environment, so we don't support them in a large-scale production environment. Because this is just a lab environment, it's not a big deal, so we'll accept that and move on. Next, what do? We take a look and we see that it is ready to go ahead and do a fresh install as opposed to an upgrade. It's going to do an install of ESXi 8.0.0 on this storage device, that is storage controller 0, channel 0, target 0, LUN 0, and that this device, this storage volume, will be completely repartitioned. But we saw in the details window that there are no partitions on it, so there's no risk of data loss here. So I'm going to click in the window, hit F11. The installer takes about 2 to 3 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just let the installer go, and I'll talk to you when the installer is finished. Okay, the installer is finished, and we can see that the install has been successfully completed. ESXi 8.0.0 is now installed on the selected volume, and all we have to do is eject the install media and reboot. And because we booted off the network, we don't even have to eject the install media. If you were using a CD-DVD or a USB key, you would eject the CD-DVD, or you would pull out the USB key now and hit enter to reboot. So let's do that. What this does is an orderly shutdown of ESXi, and it boots off of the local media. So now would be a good time to explain what a good volume would be to install ESXi. So if you're installing ESXi, I'm going to suggest you install it on an SSD. VMware used to support ESXi on flash drives. That would be USB thumb drives or SD cards. VMware doesn't support that anymore because that media is just not reliable enough to hold an operating system. SD cards and USB thumb drives don't have any error detection and correction codes. And as a result, there's no guarantee that what you read off of those devices is exactly what was written to the devices. SSDs do have error detection and correction codes, and ESXi will work with most SATA SSDs straight out of the box. And it's very fussy about NVMe SSDs. So if you're thinking about installing ESXi on an NVMe SSD, check to make sure that your SSD is supported, or the SSD you're thinking of getting is supported, before you go out and spend good money on an SSD. There are many SSDs that simply do not work with ESXi, typically consumer SSDs, and you don't want to spend your hard-earned money on something that isn't going to meet your needs. So again, double check, make sure you get something that works. And a few more seconds, and we should be good to go. And here we are. Our ESXi host is installed. It has a default configuration, and I'll talk about that in more detail in the next video. And in the next video, I'll also talk about what you can do to apply a proper network configuration and do other post-install configuration tasks on your ESXi host. But that's it for now. Again, I'm your host, Larry Karnas of ESX Lab, and that is our video on how to install and configure ESXi 8.0. I hope you enjoyed it.